All right, let's do it. This is Church Triumphant, episode 7, continuing through the mortification by sin. So, what are we going through, David?
Yeah, we're really just expanding upon the last one. So the last episode, we're looking for the biblical root about mortification. This time we're sort of going through, yeah, as I said, just a bit more in depth, and we're talking about what mortification of sin might look like, and what it might feel like in some senses. So let's begin. Do you mortify the sin in your life? Do you make it your daily work? Always be at work while you live. Do not miss a day from it. You need to be killing sin, or it will be killing you. Being virtually dead with Christ, being made alive with Him, will not excuse you from this work. Our Savior tells us how His Father deals with every branch in Him that bears fruit, every true and living branch. He prunes it so it makes it bear more fruit. He prunes it, and not for a day or two, but while it continues to be a branch in this world. Um, I think we've lost this sense in our, like this sense of we need to kill off sin in a daily manner. Like it's a actual war that we're going through, and that we we're too comfortable with things, I think,
Hmm.
you know, and we're happy for things just to stay where it is. But I think the way that Owen sort of puts this is that he puts it in the right way. He puts it as though it's a difficult thing, and he it seems like he perfectly acknowledges that, but at the same time, he's just like, you still got to do it, like, yeah.
Hmm. I mean, that's even the killer line. You need to be killing sin, or it will be
Mm,
killing you. But
yeah.
I liked how in this section he talks about like he says you need to do it, but at the same time he talks about the Father pruning us, and
Mm,
he's talking about the same thing, modifying sin. But it's like our action is describing it in the same way as he's describing God doing it,
mm,
which I think sort of addresses something we discussed last episode, where we're talking about like that tension between, we have to do it, but like it's the Holy Spirit working through
yeah.
us, like, it's also God, and he clearly is happy to talk about us doing it and also God doing it in like literally the same paragraph. So
Mm,
like there's not a distinction. It's both.
yeah. Like it works in unison. Yeah.
Hmm.
I think something that's cool to point out too is that it says, so it may bear more fruit. Like modifying sin is really hard, and um, it's hard because I think we enjoy the things, but the purpose of it sometimes is for us to go through hardship so that we will bear more fruit. So I
Hmm.
remember I was reading like this book called The Divine Art of Contentment, and he was talking about how a lot of times um, we can desire something, but by desiring that thing, the end consequence is usually worse. So what God does is He steers us away into another direction, and by steering us away into another direction, at first we're like, "What the heck? Why would He want to do this? Like this one seems so clearly like it's the better one." But then when
Hmm.
we look at the other people who went that same direction, it's sort of like scuffed. And so one of the examples the guy gives is with Lot and how he chose Sodom, and then Abraham doesn't choose Sodom, like he gives him first choice. And he's just like, oh, look at this example. And it's, yeah, he gives much more examples, but it's quite interesting of that idea. And I think the same way, we often think that when we try to kill off sin, it's not a, there's a little part of us that we don't want to do it because we don't think it's like the best thing to do.
Hmm.
But then at the same time, it's like, oh, maybe this is what faith looks like. Faith is doing it even though it doesn't seem like it's the best idea for us.
Hmm.
Yeah, let's continue. And the apostle tells you what his own practice was. I subdue my body and bring it into submission. I do it daily, he says. It is the work of my life I do not omit. This is my business. And if this was the work and business of Paul, He was so exceptionally gifted in grace, revelations, enjoyment, privileges, and consolations, well beyond the ordinary believer. Why would we be exempt from this work and the duty while we're in this world? So I think we generally have an admiration for Paul. Like we think of this guy as the goat, like there's no greater saint, I reckon, than Paul. This guy is just like he's OP. And I think generally we have this perception of people where we think very highly of them. So like we think at least in Sydney circles like Calvin or like the uh old dead dudes, and we're just like, how the heck did they think like this? But I think what we figure at the same time is that they reached that point through mortifying sin. Like they reached that point. It wasn't like they just magically got there. It took a lot of time for them, probably.
Mm.
And I imagine it's still an ongoing struggle. But I think that's what I find people who are most admirable aren't the people who are like just wall off immediately. It's the people like it's those stories where they start from the bottom and they work through like all this hardship and whatnot. And it's not that they reach the top necessarily. Like that's definitely a part of it. But I think what people find uh inspiring about the stories is their constant push through to getting to the top.
Mm. So just as Paul did it, we have to do it. Which
Yeah.
is interesting because like we talk about, oh yeah, Paul is so good, look at all of these things he did. But we very rarely be like, this is actually an example. So we should be doing these things. And like if you follow the book of Acts, for example, like he's getting beat, he's getting locked
Mm.
up, he's getting like roasted. It's not exactly the most desirable thing that everyone wants to go through. And like so when people like talk up Paul or other people, like sometimes I wonder like is why we try to elevate them so high is like could there be a side effect of that is we think because they're so up there then they're
Mm.
like special, they're them, they do that things, we're not
Yeah.
them, we're just normal people, so we do our own thing.
Mm.
Whereas you would, I think ideally it's like we should admire and look up and be inspired by these guys to do the same things that they did, to want to emulate them and follow their example.
Mm. Yeah, I think part of it is that we want like the easy answers. So I remember like in my discipleship training group, we were going through, what were we going through? We're going through Galatians. Galatians, I think it was 5, and we're just talking about like, um, we're talking about like preventing us from sinning, and then the Bible study later was like, so from the passage, like, how do we stop sinning? And then everyone is just like, to stop gratifying the flesh. And then everyone's just like the most unsatisfied answer because we're just hoping that it's a more complex thing, like it's
Mm.
more elaborate. But in reality, the instruction is it's really that simple. It's you just have to stop doing it. And I don't know, like do you feel the same way? Like do you feel like there's times when we just want a more complex answer? And yeah.
Well, it's like you're hoping for like some secret hidden thing which no one's heard of before, that as soon as you find it, like bam, it's gonna be the magic bullet. But it's
Yeah.
like in the end you just have to do it, and there's no way around that.
Yeah, but that's also what makes it hard, I think. Well, at least for
Mm.
me, like, it is really that simple in terms of the structure itself. But yeah, I think there's a part of me that also wants something to be more complicated or more of a, like as you're saying, like a secret formula to
Mm.
getting it.
It's like the simple hard path where like, do we really have to take that? And like
Yeah.
sometimes I feel like everyone deep down knows that this is the way, but they maybe subconsciously just like skirt around it. I remember
Mm.
while we were having this discussion, it was during online church in the lockdowns last year. And there was some discussion about repentance. Everyone's like, we're talking about repentance. Like, how do you know if youth or someone is actually repenting? And people are like, you know, maybe they sound sorry, or
Mm.
like they had all these different things, and like people were like giving all these elaborate answers, like, you know, they did this and then that, and then, you know, when you look at them, there's this and that. And I was like, isn't it just they stopped doing it, and then you like know for sure that they're repentant? And everyone just kind of like, oh yeah, because it was almost, I felt like the vibe was almost, it was taken for a given that whatever this theoretical person we're talking about, like they're not actually going to stop doing it. And I'm like,
Mm.
wait, but if they just stop doing it, then that's how you know for sure that they're repentant, right? Like they didn't do it
Yeah.
anymore.
Mm. Yeah. Um. Cool. Um. Let's continue. When sin lets us alone, we may let sin alone. But sin is never less quiet than when it seems most quiet. Its waters are deepest when it's still. So we need to be vigorously rooting out sin at all times and in all conditions, even where we least suspect it. It continues, lust is still tempting and conceiving sin. In every moral action, sin inclines towards evil, or it hinders good, or it disengages the spirit from communion with God, inclines to evil. Um, the thought that I had with this was that we often talk about sin growing in the dark, right? And that's definitely true. Sin definitely does grow in the dark when, we don't have people to be held accountable. And I think that's one of the great joys and privileges to be in Christian community. It's that we get to, as I guess we were talking about in our last Bonhoeffer episode, like we get to confess, and that's a really powerful thing to do. But I think what we often I think the the trap that we fall into is that sin multiplies when we're content with things and we're half-heartedly killing it. And I think in some ways it's way more dangerous to um, give it like a half-hearted approach to it as opposed to no approach to it at all. And the reason why I say that is because we trick ourselves into doing something, right? But in
Mm.
reality, we're not actually doing anything at all. It's just like, oh, if it's convenient for me, then I'll do it. But that's actually it could be potentially more dangerous because we're living way too content with everything, and because of that, it actually multiplies. Although we have that pride in ourselves, where we're like, oh yeah, but am doing something, you know.
What do you mean by like content, but still sort of half-heartedly trying to kill it?
Yeah, so like if it conveniently happens to come my way, like, or someone calls me for money or whatever, then yeah, like sorry, maybe I struggle with the sin of greed or whatever. And then I'm out in Cadborough and someone asks for like a bubble tea shop. Fair enough, like $5, that's not a big deal. Right. But in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'm actually being pretty generous here. Like I'm taking away the sin of greed here.
Hmm.
But in reality, like it you could be still like, I don't know, working 80-hour weeks and you're still earning like a bucket load. So even
Hmm.
though like you've you've conveniently like resisted temptation of greed in one sense, but you're using that temptation to sort of override everything else in your life. And with
Hmm.
that, like it's like a half-hearted attempt. Like you're not totally opposed to it, but at the same time, you're not like all in to try to kill it. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
like it
Yeah.
sounds a bit like you're sort of cutting off the low-hanging branches, and you're like, you know, I did a good job. Like, you know, at Cabra, I shout that guy bubble tea. You know, I shout people here and there, so I'm good on that front. But there's still like the whole tree is still there. Like you're not chopping down the thing at its roots.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I actually feel, I reckon that's actually how we approach most sin. It's like we're very happy to cut off like the superficial manifestations, especially the ones which on the surface, if no one like when someone looks at the very surface, like everything will look fine. Like, you know, people at church will be like, you know, he's a nice guy. He shouts people bubble tea. Like, he's a cool
Mm.
guy. But yeah, it's like they don't see you making sacrifices like in your work life, in your priorities to like grind as much money as you can.
Mm. Yeah, and I think we can start like you can make a clear distinction for those who actually go all in for something, right? Like we can say it even like in just general life with like gym or whatever, right? Like you can see like body transformations, and it's like, oh, that's really cool. Like in three months, you know, you lost like X amount of weight. That's really cool.
Mm,
But I think it's the same sense. You can tell when someone is like actively trying to mortify their sin. And I think they stand out to some degree because in the midst of myself included, like people who half-heartedly kill sin, like it's very evident when you see someone who's like proactively trying to kill sin like every waking moment of their day, just as like the previous quote was talking about.
mm,
Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about in this quote was that it's very often that we hear that, let's say, like I confess to you a sin, and I'm like, oh, you know, like I played too many games today, and then the most common response is, I think you're growing because at least you acknowledge it,
mm,
right? And it's like the very acknowledgement that it's a sin is indication that you're growing. That's
mm,
true. Like, don't get me wrong, 100% true. But the problem with that is that we've failed to go beyond that. We're content to be like, okay, like I passed now, right? Like I'm growing. But we're not called to be listeners. We're called to be doers. Like we're called to like not only take it from step one. It's like step one is just it's literally the first step. Like you want to keep going through it.
mm. Yeah. I think that relates to what you were saying before, like that half-heartedness. Because we're sort of like, you know, the first box we've ticked that off. We're like, you know, we're making steps, but then we're happy to stay on the first step because we're like, you know, at least we're not on the ground, so
Yeah.
we're good, right? We're not rock bottom. And then I think maybe even like because you mentioned if when you confess to someone else, if you confess to me, like I think also when you're the brother that's like hearing someone going through things, like there's also a temptation for you to, I guess, be more lenient with things because you know if you can say you know you're on the right track, then like you don't have to say the hard words. You can just be like, you know, you acknowledge it, good job, even if it's
Mm.
like the 10th or 100th time they've told you, and then like that is very comforting because like you you don't have to do the uncomfortable task of saying like, you know, you've struggled with this, you've acknowledged it, but hey, look, man, it's been a year, it's been 2 years, it's been 3 years. Like, what's happening? When are you going to take the next step?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's a much harder thing to rebuke someone than just to sort of let them off. Um, when you're talking, I was sort of thinking about like maybe part of it is because we can't say that difficult thing because we're not enacting the difficult thing ourselves. And
Mm,
so by the very act of calling it out, it's also an implication that it's not okay in our lives,
yeah.
you know?
Mm. I think
And I
you're
think that's the,
100% right. Yeah.
yeah,
And
like
then
that's the
that,
difficult thing.
yeah, because calling them out means like, crap, now that I've said this, like, I can't be doing the same thing. And then that would force you to also take the sin in your life more seriously too.
Hmm. Yeah. I wonder like what the cycle out of it is though, you know?
Mm.
Because in like if you run that simulation through, I guess it would just be two people who don't want to call each other out because the way out is to be called out, but no one, no one's willing to do it.
Yeah. I mean, that's why he wrote this section, right? He's like, wake up. You need to
Mm,
be you need to be killing it. And
That's true.
if you're, I think like my takeaway from this paragraph is if you're happy with your, I don't know, your rate of growth or like your rate of modification, then like you're still content. Like you said, you need to always be pushing for more, to be killing more.
Hmm. Like you need to be like pushing the very edges of your boundaries like each
Yeah,
day.
it's like you have
Otherwise, you're
to.
too content.
It's not just having a velocity, but to use a physics metaphor, there also needs to be acceleration. You gotta be
Hmm.
getting faster.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Let's continue. This next part sort of talks about leadership, or at least the way that I was thinking about it. Sin not only strives, acts, rebels, disrupts, and disturbs us, but it also, if let alone, but if it is left alone, it is not continually mortified. It will produce great, cursed, scandalous, soul-destroying sins. You know what it did to David and many others? Sin always aims at the extreme. If it had its way, every time it rises up to tempt or entice, it would go out to the most extreme sin of that kind. If it could, every unclean thought or glance would become adultery. Every covetous desire would become oppression. If it were to allow its own reign, every thought of unbelief would become atheism. Men may reach a point where sin is so unrestrained it no longer stings their conscience. The most outrageous sin no longer seems scandalous. If every impulse of lust was satisfied, it would reach a height of validity. Sin is like the grave that is never satisfied. Um, the point that I boldened or highlighted was sin always aims at the extreme. And I think of the Ravi Zacharias scandal and how scary it was in bringing damage to the gospel. Like it would have been one thing if it was just like, you know, your local church pastor. Like that in itself is already really bad and it affects like the entire community. But Ravi at least was a global apologist. Like he was like the front lines for Christian like theology and like apologetics and stuff. And
Hmm.
so when I think when the scandal was sort of released, it 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 was very clear how much it hurt the Christian community.
Hmm.
But I haven't heard about the non-Christian side of things and how that like that interplay between I guess Christian apologetics and atheism or whatever is going. But I imagine that it is not doing good for us at all. Um,
Yeah, it has
and
to be
that
because he was like debating atheists and like talking to people, having like these massive conferences. There's no way it didn't have an effect.
yeah, and like in some ways he was like considered like the top because most apologetic apologists, you know, like they're really good on their feet. But Ravi had this sense of like humility to him and like this genuineness to him that I think some apologists definitely do, but like for him, it was just like this gentle old man tone, and it's like, you know, this guy's legit. So then when this scandal happened, um, yeah, I just imagine that it's gosh, it would have damaged so many people.
Hmm.
But I bring this up because I remember I was listening to like when this all unfolded. I was listening to some podcast and he was saying how um for him to do what he's done, like the sins he's committed, he must have went through a lot of like it would have been like a tight interweb of different things he's orchestrated in order for it to work for such a long period of time. And I'm not here to like judge or anything, but I'm just saying like it's so true that we can reach a point when sin no longer affects our conscience.
Hmm.
And like that's for Ravi at least, when I look at that example, like that's scary about how many lives it sort of impacts. And so I'm not surprised that, Satan regularly tries to like tempt like the highest in our church communities.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Like it's so scary how ingrained it can be. And you said like he gave this vibe of like, being this genuine, humble old guy. But yeah, I read through the report that got commissioned, and like
Hmm.
some of the stories are like crazy. Like it's just the the absolute almost like pride, but like I don't know what like the something like extreme assertiveness. He's just like, yeah, this just do it. This is it. And at the same time, like this was all done while he's flying in between his talks and his conferences. Like it's like, oh goodness. And like I remember reading that even on his deathbed, he would swear that, he didn't do anything wrong. Like it was all
Hmm.
chopped up. Like it's all just a smear campaign against him. So like he was so hardened that even on his deathbed, he never confessed any of this. And that's like I think that exactly demonstrates the what this paragraph's talking about, how sin can be so extreme and so hardening to
Hmm.
us. And like I think we should be scared because there with sin we can't have a peace treaty. There's no sort of ceasefire. It's either we're either gaining ground or we're losing ground to it.
Hmm. Yeah, when you were talking, it sort of made me think about being in like Ravi's shoes and how confessing what he's done would have been terrifying. Like, like you can just imagine him just going to like his closest friends and he's just like pouring his heart out, explaining what he's done, and then if they responded correctly, it would have been like him stepping down from things and him having to explain to the public or potentially explain to the public what he's done.
It would be
But
a
that would have,
complete humbling.
yeah, and that would have just been so scary, right? Like I'm in some level of position of leadership, and doing that is just like my very low level compared to him is just like holy crap, how the heck can I do this? Like it's crazy. But I think yeah, the way that you mentioned it is a humbling. Like Christian leaders aren't immune to the power of sin, and so we need to be regularly humbled to things. And I don't think we have that very often. There's not many times when Christian leaders should be humbled, um, especially given the natural pedestal I guess they put on, where they're preaching in front of people or they're teaching the Bible, and yeah, it's very easy for us to, I guess, not have the right accountability for them
Mm.
and for them to confess sin. I think, yeah,
Mm. I mean that just points back to Bonhoeffer, right? We need confession. We need to be
yeah,
confessing.
it's true. Yeah. Um, the other thing I wanted to point out with this is that sin isn't discriminatory. Like, I think the way he says it, sin is like the grave that is never satisfied. Like, it's going to take down everyone it can with them. And so, if
Mm.
Christian leaders, like someone like as good as Ravi might have seemed, or like, like people who struggle with sin in higher positions of leadership that we look up to, we need as ordinary members to be much more on guard. Like it's not a mistake that they reached. I don't. Most of the time, it's not a mistake they reached those positions, and they reached it because, like, to some degree, like they showed the level of spiritual maturity that they can then lead other people to that.
Mm.
And so, like, how much more should us ordinary people be on guard that we we need to be very aware and awake to to the sins that happen to us daily.
It's if Satan's like attacking these high profile people, how much more is he just flooding us on the like in our normal local churches and our normal leadership?
Yeah. But in the same sense, it's not something that we should be scared of. Like, we should give it the weight it deserves, but that weight isn't a weight that's too overbearing that we can't overcome it. Yeah. Let's continue. Okay. This part of deceitfulness of sin which hardens men's hearts and leads them to their ruin. It is a subtle, but in its initial approach, we so succumb to it. But once it holds onto our heart, these little concessions, it gains a footing, and then it presses on, gain increasing degrees of the same kind. This continual pressing forward fools the soul into thinking the separation from God that has already happened is insignificant. It thinks that if there is no further progress, then nothing is different. To the extent the soul is made insensitive to the sin, that is, insensitive to what the gospel requires of the believer, that is the extent to which the heart is hardened. But sin still presses forward. That is because the only boundary it has is our complete relinquish of God and our opposition to Him. I think often that we have a idea that to mortify sin, it has to just be rid once and for all. But I think the way that this sort of quote is putting it is that it's not just it's a once for all thing. It's like it's what adds up over time is those subtle concessions, as he says it, or those subtle like surrenders to sin. And I think in the day-to-day battle against it, as he's sort of been putting in this chapter, that's really the battle that's happening. It's we need to stop having these little forfeits to like our gratifying our desires. Yeah, and I think that I think we still see it in everything else we do. Like it's typical for me just to say 5 more minutes in bed, or like one more YouTube video, and my one more YouTube video turns into like 2 hours or whatever. Or like it's the subtle and small decisions a husband makes to hang out with a coworker, like of the opposite gender. Or, it's the 1 or 2 late night phone calls with a girl. Like, it's these small things that we're very aware of, that happen in other ways in our life, but it seems like we're much more lax relative to the weight of sin as compared to other things. So, like, I remember a few years ago, when the church was a bit Nazi-like with BGR in youth group. And I know the extent of this because I was the one that got hit most of the time because I was an idiot. But we were so strict about certain stuff with BGR. And like, fair enough, like to a degree, like it's a serious topic. And that's where a lot of like the youth fell. But man, like what happens if we had the same stance on BGR as we did to like little inclinations to sin?
Yeah, I think that whole like little inclination thing, that is how it gets us, because it's just a small thing, so we're like, all right, that's okay, just this little thing, just this once, just today, and it always spirals and becomes more. And with something like BGR, it's a public thing because you're two people in a relationship. Like it's very easy to point out and shut down. And I think the ironic thing is like there is nothing sinful about two people entering a relationship. It's not even like there's potential dangers, but it's not even an actual sin. Whereas we don't say the same thing of, for example, like raging in games or being toxic. That is like that is not only tolerated. It's like people make jokes about it. Like it's like everyone acknowledges it's bad, but we just sort of laugh it off,
Yeah,
and
we shrug it off.
we just laugh and be, oh yeah, that guy's toxic. Like, oh, I can get a bit toxic. I can get a bit tilted.
Mm.
But that's something that's so much different to like a relationship because it's small, it's all the time, and most people don't see it. Most of the time, you're not going to see someone raging in the game. At
Mm.
least, actually, it depends. It depends. Some people more than others.
Relatable. Yes.
Yeah, but I think with the BGR thing, that's something that is easily hit down because I think, like what you said before, how when you when you hit it down, something that prevents you from hitting it down is that then you would have to deal with it yourself. And a lot of the leaders are already like in relationships or married, so that's like a safe thing for them. Whereas obviously not the same with the youth.
Yeah.
So they're from this like, this high place, they can speak down. Whereas with the other things which are explicitly sins and which are probably common for youth too, like raging anger or greed or like desire for popularity and status, like
Mm.
those are all things which are much harder because like everyone is going to struggle with that.
Right. So like they can only call out like VGR because they sort of had that realm covered to a degree. Like they're in a safe haven of sorts. But for other things that are a bit more difficult, like anger or whatever,
Yeah, it's a lot harder.
it's yeah. Hmm. I never thought about that. That's really interesting. My thought was that it was just a very disproportionate weighting of certain things. And I didn't think about what you were saying because I don't know, like, yeah, BGR to me has always just been like a stay away, like, let's try to avoid it, especially in high school. But you're right, like, that's such a odd phenomenon that we face that BGR is held a higher weighting than
Mm,
literal anger, which, as Jesus puts it, it's the equivalent of murdering someone. It's like, this is not a small, trivial, like, funny thing that happened in game.
mm,
Like it's we need to do something about this.
yeah, and like the ironic thing is that like, it didn't even work. Like if you look at what actually happened, like people just went and did what they wanted to do anyways. And I think with something that's not explicitly a sin, like BGR, then you don't that there's nothing morally wrong about two people being interested in entering a relationship. Like these
Mm.
people need to be guided and given advice, not shut down, made jokes of, and stigmatized.
Yeah, that's very true.
But yeah, to be
Yeah,
fair, like not to be ungrateful to our leaders. Like they did their best, and it's good that they did take that seriously because that still I think that all helped us to think about it more seriously than
yeah.
if the attitude was just, oh yeah, do whatever you want, she'll be right.
Mm. Yeah, to be fair, like I think the people who ended up eventually dating, myself included, um, had quite a lot of support from leaders.
Mm,
Or at least from my end. Like, yeah, I met up with someone like weekly and I was guided with my relationship. But I think it was the process before that, which was
mm.
like you're being stared down from like ivory towers and everything, you know.
That's a
Um,
funny thing because before you're in it, everyone's like hostile, making fun of you. As soon as you're in it, it's like a switch is flipped.
yeah, it's like a whole different approach is taken.
Mm,
Um, but in some ways, now I think about it, it might be the other way. Like it's not that we shouldn't be like sorry, it's not that we should let everyone do whatever they want. It's like, let's still be cautious.
Mm.
If they decide to do it, fair enough. But then that's when we should switch on the Nazi switch, right? That's when we tell them off. You know, we're very accountable with them, especially at that age.
Mm.
Yeah. The last thing that I wanted to chat about with this quote was the little concessions, as he says it, to sin. And I was thinking how there was a quote in my high school, because like teachers have all these inspirational posters or
Oh,
whatever, and one of them was like, to I can't remember. It was something like to do with a mountain, and to climb up mountains is like one step at a time. And the whole day was like, it's one day at a time until you hit your seat. Like just take it slow or whatever. And it's that slowly chipping away of things, which we we use often for progress, right? It's like, 4 kilometers, like I've run, and then all right, tomorrow I'll do like 4.5 or whatever, and it's that slow increase. But we often don't look at it in the reverse way. We don't look at it as the slow increments downwards to sin, and the slow chipping away to make our hearts hardened.
mm. I think you're 100% right. It works both ways because we can take one step up the mountain, but sin is taking one step at a time in our own lives. It's constantly chipping away at things. And it makes sense because that's the optimum strategy. You attack these small things that give way without much resistance. And then over time you gain more and more territory. That's actually like that's a legit military tactic. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, like it it has a name, salami slicing. So if just this is just because I'm a nerd, but if you look into like what China does in the South China Sea, it's the exact same strategy where you take little things which people don't care too much about, and then that gets reinforced, and then that pretty much comes accepted. This is just how it is, and then you move on. And
Yeah.
we let sin do that very easily to our lives. We just say,
So
like, I'll
sorry.
just take a break today. So, I'll just take a rest, watch some YouTube. Everyone needs to rest a bit. Didn't God say we need to rest?
Yeah.
And then that quickly turns into like every second day and then every night. And then soon it's just this routine that
Hmm.
you spend hours on YouTube watching these pointless things you don't care about.
Yeah. So sorry for the South China Sea incident. Is it like a massive uh internationally political debated thing now that it's like because they're taking small increments at a time? Like, do they have quite a big chunk of land now?
Well, in that
Or is,
situation, it's pretty much small islands. So
yeah.
they'll like take an island, start building like a military base on it. So they'll start building a runway, they'll start parking ships and planes there. And then so when, for example, a Philippine fishing boat wants to go fish there because it's international waters, legally they're allowed to. And then the Chinese, they just send out their boats and say, you can't do that. And then,
Hmm.
he's just a fisherman, so he says, okay. And it's not like the Philippines has an army big enough to contest that.
Yeah.
And then they move on. Then the next island and the next island. And
All
that's
right.
actually one of the um biggest political spots of tension in the Pacific region. So if you can read like Australian defense white papers, they're publicly
Mhm.
available. And in the 2020 defense strategic update, like a South China Sea was one of the potential flashpoints for conflict.
Jeez. So is it a point where China just basically has like a ton of islands and people can't do much about it, and they're just slowly gaining ground?
Pretty
Like,
much. Because what happens is once they have the island, they convert that into what is essentially a stationary air carrier. And
holy
a
crap.
carrier ship is the biggest, it's the ultimate tool of power projection in today's modern world. If you have a carrier of planes that you can send to other places in the world, that's how you project power. And so they basically
Jeez.
have like ones that are permanently there. but that was through a process of like slowly,
Mm.
one thing at a time, leveraging different levers to get that allowed, because it's one small step at a time, and then
Yeah.
soon you have this entrenched monster, which is very difficult to get rid of.
Mm. Yeah. I was thinking like it's that it's like in Proverbs where I can't remember which one, but it's sort of like if you act upon something now, then you don't need to deal with the bigger consequences later. And it's evident in the South China Sea, obviously. But
Mm.
we don't take the same thing with sin. Like
Hmm.
we need to act now on it before like it happens like Ravi, unfortunately, or like our little small inclinations to raging in games. Like it can get out of hand, and I wouldn't be surprised if this sort of tendency to keep growing with anger could lead to like instances of domestic violence or whatever,
Mm.
because you just haven't controlled it. Um, the way that I sort of thought about this inclination of things. So I'm touching on the point where it says, but sin still presses forward. That is because the only boundary it has is the complete relinquishment.
Relinquishment.
I can't pronounce relinquishment of God and our opposition to Him. And so, like, I think of like in those animes where like two people are, like in Dragon Ball Z when they're like two like the Kamehameha, and there's just like pure sheer willpower about which one is stronger.
Mm.
And that's the thing, because sin is gonna keep pressing forward regardless of what you want. And for us, we have a boundary to a degree. We're like, oh yeah, my aim is to stop like being greedy, or like I want to give away 10%. If I give away 10%, like I'm good, I'm happy. But for sin, like his like Kamehameha is like his sheer willpower is so strong that we need to have a match to it. You know what I mean? Like we can't dream small.
Mm. And I think in the situation of Kamehameha, it's pretty obvious. It's coming towards you, right? It's a
Yeah.
very direct thing. And sin is the difference between that and sin is that sin isn't going to come directly at you. Like if you say, I'm not going to do this, but like, okay, sure, I'll do everything except that. So it would just sort of sidestep and then still take over everything else. And then
Mm.
after a while, because it has everything else, you're like, all right, may as well give this thing up since I'm already doing all these other things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you have to be constantly on guard, and it's not just
Mm.
about one particular sin. It was sort of like what I was talking about last episode, and what Owens would eventually get to. But he makes the point that to kill off sin, it's it's an entire sanctification of self. It's not just one aspect of your life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's continue. Nothing can prevent this infiltration of mortification. Mortification would wither the root of sin and strike at its head every hour, so that whatever it aims, it will thwart. If the best saint in the world shrinks this duty, he will fail into as many curses as anyone else. Um, it's fine for us. It's time for us to fight back. Like I think we've been asleep for too long, and we haven't been striking at the root of sin. We've been striking at the leaves and the branches of sin, but we're not killing the very problem, you know. So like I have like two accountability groups, one of which you're in, and a lot of times we bring up like different situations that's happened, and we're like, oh, I'm so prideful. I'm so like such a jerk. I'm not patient enough, and that's true. Like those are the small instances where it's sort sorry, those small instances tell us where the sin lies. But we're hitting the wrong thing, I think. Like it's it's good that we sort of address this like those uh habits that happen in our lives where sin manifests, but I don't know. Like maybe attacking all of those like branches would eventually like hit at the root, but it doesn't seem like we have much conversation about hitting the very root, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Like we don't bring it down to that level. We just keep it at road rage, or we keep it at toxic like gaming or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
it's a good point. We have to do that. And I guess it depends on how you talk about it, because it's easy to just get caught up in that one incident and be like, okay, how can we stop how can we stop this happening like the next time you get into the car? But the underlying anger, like you said, the root that causes that is going to be everywhere, not just
Hmm.
in the car. So Owens makes a good point. We need to constantly be trying to modify sin everywhere.
Yeah. Um, like I think about like PMO and how often we talk about PMO as just what it is, like pornography, but we often forget that it goes beyond much more than just the internet. It's like it's a thing that you sort of live with to some degree, and
Mm,
like images or whatnot, or like fantasies remain in our minds, and that's unspoken about, I think, for the most part.
mm,
Or like even times of, I think, bitterness, like it obviously would come out at times when you're just like you're salty about something, and you just like rant to your friend about it. But I believe we're much more bitter than what we say,
mm. Yeah.
and I think that's the thing I'm trying to address. Like we need to hit hard on these things.
Mm. I think bitterness, especially, is one of those things which rarely gets openly talked about, um, especially in the church. I think it's one of those things where you need distance to talk about. And so people are probably a lot more comfortable talking to like someone unrelated. They're like, this person's been doing this to me, it pisses me off. But with like the actual people involved in the communities, it's very hard to bring to light. And
Hmm.
but you see it, I think, in how people talk about other people. If if they tend to, for example, maybe they talk about people in a way which like focuses on some X like thing they do which is really bad, and this person always brings up every time. Like you can probably say, yeah, I'm detecting some bitterness, but that underlying bitterness is never talked about. It's always like this person doesn't do this, why are they always like this, something like that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we address these at the wrong level. I think this is what I'm trying to get at. Like we address it at fixing the action, and we believe that fixing the action would result in the mortification of sin. But I don't think that's really the case. Like I think the actual case of how it works is that we mortify sin by reflecting on God's truths. So like last night I was talking to someone, and um yeah, I guess they just have a lot of ongoing family problems, and it's difficult for them to forgive. And I think that's relatable for a lot of people. And the I think sorry, even at a church level, I think we struggle with this. Like how do I forgive someone who's unrepentant? And the thought that I was sort of having in my mind was like, you forgive not because of their actions. You forgive based upon what God has done. And I think for something like bitterness, it's the same thing. Like we need to speak into it through truth. And we do that by talking about God's character, and reminding the person that through Christ he offers something greater, or he's shown mercy to us in the sense of we were once bitter, but he showed us grace and mercy and love to us. And now that we're like his followers, we should do the same to the next.
Mm,
But that's that's the level we don't get to, I don't think. And I think what this great fight I'm talking about, like this time to fight back, is getting back on track to that. So I remember I had a really good uni friend. She graduated now, and she was like an English major, and it was during Ancon, and she was just thinking like, what does encourage mean? And for her, she was like, all right, well, in is sort of like if you think about like enable, like the in allows the able to happen. So you're able to do something through the, in this situation, in, right? So encourage is to give courage to someone, was how she understood it. And I was like, that's a very interesting idea. And so like last Wednesday, one of the pastors' wives is part of my discipleship training group, and she was spitting fire about like memorizing scripture to kill off sin. And she was just like, she went on this huge monologue. And this is Zoom, and everyone's just like, oh, they're still pretty tired from work. Fair enough. But for me, I was just like smiling the whole time. I was like, my jaw actually hurt afterwards. And I was like, holy crap, this is gold, man. Like, holy crap. And this is like, I think this was the part when I was thinking about, I was like, I'm encouraged. Like, I have courage to fight sin again through this monologue. And I was like, damn, we need to do this, man. Like, oh man.
Hmm. I think that that's a good point because we talked about mortification of sin, and I think so far we've primarily had individuals find this battle, but we can get so much courage from other people, and we should be trying to give that to other people. We're all
Hmm.
fighting this together.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let's continue. The contest is for our lives and our souls. Not employing the spirit and the new nature to mortify sin daily is ignoring the excellent assistance that God has given us against the greatest enemy. If we neglect to use what we've received, God may justly hold back giving more. His grace and his gifts are bestowed on us to use, to exercise, and to trade with. Not mortifying sin daily is sinning against the goodness, kindness, wisdom, and love of God who furnished us with the help and moral strength we need to do that. I think back to Bonhoeffer, and it's sort of near the start, and Bonhoeffer talks about like how can we ask for greater gifts if we're not thankful for the small things we've been given? And this is the exact same. Like, how can we keep asking God for help? Like, it's in every single prayer I have, right? It's like, how can I pray for you? Every single prayer point's like, oh, I need help with this. I need help with that. Like, okay, I understand that. But at the same time, it's like, are you really doing it? Like, I'm talking to myself, obviously, too. Like, are you really trying to help yourself? Like, in reality, you have the necessary things to kill off sin because God doesn't tempt us more than we can bear. So in all these situations where these little inclinations happen and like tempt us to go down the mountain, we actually have the power to go up the mountain instead. But we're not using the small things that like we've been given. We're hoping that some magic miracle will happen where everything changes. But in reality, that's not actually the case.
That is a very good point. We
Mm.
have what we need. He's given it to us.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think like part of it is that we haven't counted like the cost properly. Like I think back to Jesus and like what kind of king doesn't count off the cost before he goes to war? And in some senses, like maybe I understand it's like a Christian thing that we still we still struggle with ongoing sin. But at the same time, like I think what we're experiencing um is what I'm experiencing to some degree is that it's not just that I'm struggling with ongoing sin. It's that I'm content with going with ongoing sin. And I'm still praying that something big would happen and that this big thing would change everything. But in reality, if I counted the cost well, like these small things wouldn't happen. Or like it wouldn't happen as frequently as I would like them.
Mm. So you're saying we too easily ask for just more of this. If I only had a little bit more help, when God already has given us all this, we need to do it
Yeah.
rather than just keep on asking for help when He's already given us what we need to combat what we need to fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I remember like my former mentor saying like, yeah, actually, if you think about it, you have so many opportunities to evangelize, but we keep asking for opportunities to evangelize, but we're just not taking it. You know, like we are. I think we are asking for those really convenient times when it's easy for us to do it. So, like for instance, if I'm eating lunch with a friend, a non-Christian friend, like that's an opportunity to evangelize. Like that literally is an opportunity. But I think
Mm.
the way that we're defining opportunity is one where it's like the stars align, you know, and
It's
like
handed
they
perfectly into our
yeah,
lap. We don't have to do
yeah.
anything. We just put the final finishing touch, and we did
Yeah.
it.
Like we have to be so hard carried by God. But yeah, we
Mm.
forget, like as you were saying earlier, that synergy, right? Like it's it's the same. We need to work with him. And
Mm.
I think we would work with him when we take on these small opportunities or these small gifts that are given to us.
True.
Mm. Um, the last thing that I wanted to chat about in this one is that, oh man, I think we already spoke a bit about it, but I love how he's not being passive is not just a matter of being passive. Like it's not a neutral stance. It's a stance where, as he says it, he's saying, not mortifying sin daily is sinning against the goodness, kindness, wisdom, grace, and love of God, who
Mm.
furnished us with the help. Like being idle to sin is not neutral. It's an act of active defiance against God and all that He's done for us.
Mm. Yeah. It's pretty much squandering like this great gift that we've been given, and we
Mm.
just say, I'm going to go off and do this and ignore it.
Yeah,
But I
like
think
it's
the flip side to that is that the gift's still there. We just take it. If we just use what we have, what's left, then we can do it. And I was reading recently this. I was reading this book by Sundar Singh, the Indian dude, and he used this parable of this guy who he's walking along the river. He finds some rocks that he starts like skimming them, throwing them around, and
mm,
then halfway through he realizes that those rocks were actually diamonds. So he's just been like chucking away these precious jewels the whole time. But the whole point is that yes, he threw away all these things, but he still has like some left in his pocket, and
mm,
so he can make the most of what he still has left. It's still there. And he used that analogy to point to the fact that every day God gives us is filled with gift and blessing if we use the day well and not just waste it.
yeah, yeah. And I think that the trap that we've fallen into is that our sin's too big now. You know, it's too much of a burden now. It's like it's the night before your assignment's due. It's like a 4K essay. You haven't started, and you're already giving up because it's too big of a thing. And so you already accept, like, all right, I'm just gonna hand it in late. I'm gonna cop the -3% or whatever. But in reality, that's not the situation. It's never too late. Like I remember in my prac, I was very, very lenient on kids in the first few weeks, just because I'm like a 21-year-old who has no idea what's going on. And my supervisors are like, David, I think you need to be more strict. And it's just like, I think you need to like start making classroom routines. And I was just like in my mind, I was like, oh, but this is my this is my last week, second last week. Like, how the heck am I gonna do that? Like, it's not gonna work. And she's just like, oh, like it's not too late. Like, like you still need to like putting the effort in now would eventually make the difference. And I tried it, like, and during the last few lessons, like my classes were very quiet relative to before. And I think it's the same thing. It's like we think it's too late, but it's really not, Yeah.
Mm.
The biggest lie we tell ourselves is that I'm just a toxic person, or like I'm just a person I can't forgive someone even when they don't show forgiveness. But that's not the case.
Mm. And I think that's the easy path, because if you give up, then you don't have any obligation to do anything, because if you're just a toxic person, then you can't help it. So
Yeah.
why should you try? Because that's just who you are.
Yeah.
But yeah, as we saw before, there's no, like, sin doesn't just stay there. It's always advancing. You can't have a peace with it. You have to keep fighting, keep mortifying it.
Yeah. And it's like every time you keep saying that, it's pushing against you. It's making it bigger.
That's what I want you to think.
Yeah.
Everything's all right. It's just how it is. It always was this way. There's no way it
Mm.
can change. Mm.
Yeah. Let's continue, hey. Exercise and success are the two main havens of grace in the heart. When grace is abandoned, it withers and decays. The things of grace are ready to die, and sin gains ground towards hardening the heart. What I mean by this is by ignoring this duty, grace withers, lust flourishes, and the condition of the heart grows worse and worse. The Lord knows what desperate and fearful effects sin has had with many people. We neglect mortification. Sin gets the substantial victory, and it breaks the bones of the soul. It makes a man weak, sick, and ready to die so that he cannot look up. When we take blow after blow, wound after wound, foil after foil, and never rise up in vigorous opposition, can we expect anything but the hardening through the deceitfulness of sin and finding our souls bleeding to death? I think this touches perfectly about what we're talking about. Like it's the slow chipping away. But
Mm.
I remember you telling me that when you were leading a small group at EU, this stood out to me and it still sticks out to me. The idea that you had was I want people to leave feeling more equipped to go into like serving God. Like, yeah, you want to talk a bit more about that and like how this might relate?
I think that was when I was going through to Timothy, the passage about like what scripture is useful. And it what was it? At the end, that passage says that the man of God may be equipped for every good work. And previous in the early part of the chapter, it said something about like what is the work, what is the good, is to suffer. And so I was trying to draw the connection. I was like, does that mean that the goal of this study is that we'll walk out more willing to suffer in doing good and serving people? And so like the mark of whether your Bible study has gone well is that people walk out and they're more ready to suffer. And yeah, that was, it was very, I only thought of that when I was like going through the passage. I was like,
Hmm.
wow, that's crazy. Bob was whack. But
Hmm.
yeah, we're going through it, and I hope that they walked out more ready to suffer. Um, but I think it also relates to what's saying about grace. What Owen is saying about grace here, how when we abandon it, we die. Because to be ready to suffer, to accept that you're going to suffer, and to willingly go into that is, I think there's something humbling about that. You can't, to acknowledge the fact that you can't just stay in this high, safe ground and be as comfortable as possible, but you have to actually go down and go in. And and suffer. And the only way you're going to survive and make it through that is by relying on God's grace. And yeah, I think it's a very key point, and this is similar to something I read by Saint Silouan, where he writes like, yeah, when we have grace, that's the life of the soul. But as soon as we abandon that, then we start falling. We fall into sin, and we go back to our old ways until we humble ourselves and look to God's grace again.
Yeah, like I think, man, I can't remember the last time when other than the last Wednesday, last time when it's not common, sorry, that Bible studies have that view
Hmm.
that after the study, it's not. I think we use equipped sometimes too freely, but we feel equipped to go out and like, fight for the Lord again. Like we don't feel encouraged in the sense of like enabling, encouraging. So
Mm.
yeah.
I definitely think we overuse equip, because in the original context, if you're equipped in two 2000 years, in the first century AD, you're equipped to go out to war. So you're being equipped means you could potentially die the next day. You're going out to suffer and to battle, and it's a risky thing to start equipping for war.
Wow, that's very interesting. Oh wow, it's
But because
risky
we
to
only
war.
encounter it in our modern day context, so
Yeah.
maybe we've lost that sense of what it means to be equipped.
Hmm. Equipped the risk to go out to war. Wow. Okay. So my thought was that um, we're equipping people in the sense of like gearing them up, right? Giving them good hard theology, like good Bible training. But we forgot the other part, which was this is purpose is to send them out, like make them go to war. And that's what we're forgetting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and everything we're talking about, it's basically like a war. Like we're fighting sin, we're fighting Satan, and there's real consequences if when we let it hit us. And
Hmm.
to this point about how sin makes a man weak and sick and ready to die, that like it just shows how much we need to address sin. Even with physical health, we pay so much attention to that. People spend heaps of money going to the gym. My parents like spend lots of money on vitamin supplements for health. They also like eat brown rice every day. It's like we put so much into physical health, which we should, because well, our
Yeah.
bodies are a gift. We need to be healthy and make the most of it. But our spiritual health is so much more important, and it's the consequences when that fails are so much more than just if we get sick. And sometimes I talk to people, and maybe they might be struggling to pray or to read or to trust something that God has said. And there's definitely times where I struggle with that too. But in those times, if you're struggling to pray, that's like your soul struggling to breathe. If someone's not breathing well, like this guy's sick, he needs urgent attention. But people seem so content to just be like, oh, prayer's not doing that well. Yeah, reading's it's hard to engage with God's word, which, like, to be fair, like it can be very hard. Like war
Hmm.
happens, we do get sick, but that should be ringing alarm bells. Like
Yeah.
our life is in jeopardy. Our soul is sick.
Yeah. Like it's where we so often measure our Christian spiritual well-being by Bible reading and prayer, and those are fairly good measurements. Like if you're not eating every day, like that's not very good. But from last episode, or at least his last chapter, he was saying that the life of the Christian's life is dependent upon mortifying sin. Like if
Mm,
you're not mortifying sin, you're actually dying. And so like the example he gave last time was like the old man, which is like our old represents our old self. The way that I sort of talked about was like the old heart. And he was saying like every time you give more power and life to this old man, this your fleshly desires, your new man, like that is your Christian life, slowly dies too. And we need to bring back this language of mortification to the church. Um, and I think what we forget also is that every time we slowly push back, like we're gaining more ground. Not in the sense of like, not only in the sense of pushing the boundary, but because we have more ground, it's easier for us to keep pushing back, if that makes sense.
mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like it's not surprising if someone's struggling to read or pray and they're not modifying sin because they're just getting hit. Like no wonder you can't eat. Like your body's bleeding. You're spiritually you're bleeding out. And if someone like gets sick, I remember when a church member had cancer a few years ago, and everyone was like, we need to pray, and everyone was like asking how's it going. Like
Mm,
it's like it was one of the high like agenda things to be all concerned about, which it should be.
mm.
But how much higher should be our spiritual conditions? We have multiple cancers. That's your greed, your lust, your pride. Those are all cancers which will do you in worse than any other physical cancer.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to breathe life into
Mm,
people again. The next quote I'm going to read is quite a long one, but I included this one because this touches on basically everything that we've been saying for a long time um, about our current evangelical, I guess, context. So it's a bit of a long one. I might edit like the text in so that you guys can read along. I encourage you guys to sort of meditate on it and think about, yeah, what exactly it's saying. Excuse my poor reading. Before I proceed to the next principle, I have to complain about many professed Christians these days who, instead of showing great and evident fruits of mortification, hardly bear any at all. There is a growing popular movement attracting those who display many spiritual gifts and who freely express their spirituality. There is a noise of religion and religious activities in every corner. There is preaching in abundance, and is not done in the empty, light, trivial, and vain manner it once was. For the most part, it results from a spiritual gift. If you were to measure the number of believers by the attention they draw, the numbers of gifts they show, or the professions they come or they make, the church might be prompted to ask, where did all these followers come from? But if you measure them by the fruits of mortification, this great discriminating grace of Christian, perhaps their number is not so large. There are so many of those who are converted during this popular movement, who talk about and profess their faith with a level of spirituality seldom seen before. But unfortunately, they give evidence of their miserable, unmortified heart. I will not judge them, but perhaps boast about what the Lord has done in them. If wasting time, idleness, squandering times in clubs, envy, strife, quarreling, jealousy, anger, pride, worldliness, selfishness are badges of Christians, then we have them among us in abundance. And if behavior can be found in those who have much light and which we hope is saving light, then what do we say about some who would like to be called religious, yet despite the light of the gospel? What do we say about those who know no more of the duty we are discussing then occasionally denying themselves of a few outward, harmless, and seldom practices enjoyments. May the good Lord send out a spirit of mortification to cure our diseased state, or we will wind up in a sad condition. This book was published in 1656. And man, like, some sense, we have not changed at all, right? Like, when he
Mm.
talks about the levels of spirituality, the thing that I think about in Sydney circles, and I'm very guilty of this, don't get me wrong, is this heightened sense of intellect, right? Like, we think like the biggest, baddest OP people are like big brainers, right? They're
Big
like the
brain
people who are like,
skins.
yeah, basically, like everyone would rush to their sermons, and we're trying to listen, like, oh yeah, this is great. Like, I love this guy, and I love how he preaches. But what Owen is saying is we need to not measure based upon spiritual gifts. We need to measure based upon the fruits of mortification.
Mm. Yeah. So much of this, it just applies very scaringly well in our modern situation. It's it's scary, especially when we always say, you know, we're so equipped, we have so much Bible study and Bible knowledge and good theology, but I completely agree. So much of this applies to like straight up to us, even though it was written so long ago.
Yeah, it's just, dude, like, all right, let's just assume that nothing has changed between that time until like what we're talking about now. Like, how many years of Christians has unmodifying hearts taken?
Mm.
Like, it would have been like what, like 400 years. Like, for the EU, they pray for revival, whatever that might mean. I don't exactly know what that means, but they constantly pray for revival, and I think generally, I think what it means is like for us to go out and make disciples again. But when do we ever pray for the spirit of mortification to cure our diseased state?
Mm.
Like, we're so concerned about like going out, and yeah, like Sydney Anglicans, we need to go out, right? 100%.
Mm.
But we're dying inside now, and we're content with the death of us.
Mm. Yeah, like we emphasize going out evangelizing, which is really good, but sometimes I have that same concern. I think in the back of my mind, I'm like, wait, but the average person in this church is struggling with this, struggling with that. And we're bringing people into this and telling them, here is eternal satisfaction. Here is life. Here is, which is true. In Christ there is. But if we don't live it out, then how will people see that? And
Hmm.
we you're definitely right. We need to pray for revival of ourselves and to mortify like these habitual sins that we've just let slide in and creep.
Hmm.
I'm interested in what you think these fruits of mortification actually are. Like I was wondering, what does he mean by that term?
Someone asked me the exact same question, and I was like, I don't know actually. I think fruit of mortification.
Mm. Because I assume if he was talking about mortification per se, then that would be the act of people killing their sins. But he's saying it's the fruit of that, not
Yeah,
actually that.
like it's the removal of something, not the addition of something. If that makes sense. Like the
Yeah,
fruit
or
of mortification,
what comes
what's
from
producing it?
removing that.
Yeah, yeah. What's producing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, my first response to at least my friend was, I don't know. Like, I think it's like killing sin. But now that I think about it, maybe it's like the opposite of whatever sin it was.
Hmm.
Because let's say you're killing off pride. Well, to kill off pride, as we were saying, like to root out the sin is to understand humility. So
Hmm.
maybe the fruit of mortification is you living out like what that sin you previously struggled with was.
Hmm.
Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on it?
I was thinking along the same lines. It would the first thing I would think of is the opposite of the things he's listing here. So
Mm.
wasting time, idleness, squandering time in clubs, envy, strife, quarreling, jealousy, anger, pride, worldliness, and selfishness. So clearly that's the opposite of the fruit. So the fruit has to be not those things. I feel,
Yeah. Like there's more there, right?
yeah, there's some people that I've met or read about their lives, and I'm just like, there's something different about these people. Like I remember there was this nun at was she yeah a nun at he was doing some stuff at the Catholic Society,
Mm.
and just talking she was talking about we're going through this thing called Thomas Aquinas the Summer, which is this like big 13th century basically textbook, theological textbook, except like it's not just a book, it has different volumes. So if you were to read the whole thing, it's like a stack like literally like this big.
Oh
Anyway,
my
so we're
god.
reading a very, very small section which was talking about the fittingness that Christ should come as a man. And so part of it she was talking about like how good Christ was, how he came and it was by his grace that we may be saved. And just the way she said it and the things she said, like the only thought that came to mind was like, wow, this woman is so in love with Christ. Like you can just hear it in their tone. Like when people talk about someone they really, really love, I feel they their voice changes in how they normally talk about people. And I was just like, wow, this she you can just hear it, you can see it. Like that's crazy. And I've like that strikes me because I've never seen anything to that similar level. I'm sure people like do love Christ, but at least this was so very clearly like the fruit was so clearly obvious. I was like, my goodness, where did this come from? What? I didn't know it was possible because you read about these kinds of people. If you read about like lives of saints, how some people they were clearly not worldliness in selling all those things, and they'll just beg for money and preach, or they and like okay, in theory this stuff is possible, but like yeah, it was I don't know how to describe it apart from like it
Mm.
was like this person's in love. It was crazy.
Yeah. Like the person I think of in those situations, like that figure who just absolutely loves Jesus for everything is is Saint Augustine. Like,
In the
dude,
confessions.
every freaking sentence he's like every single chapter he just relates it, but it's like, oh, I'm so thankful for God that he did this. And I'm just at first, like I think I've said this before, like at first I thought he was just being cheesy, and I was like, all right, whatever, dude, like we get it. But then as the more I read, I'm like, hold up a minute, like, whoa, this isn't just some cheesy thing he's trying to say. Like, it's not like the once off, like, oh, I just need to trust in God. It's like every single sentence, and it's like, ooh, like it's so clear that Christ is the center for everything he does. And it's
Yeah,
I think that's what you're trying to talk about. It's like that so evident love that we have.
that's a funny thing. Even in someone when they write, it just comes out in their writing. Like you can see it. And I don't even think Confessions was written for the public in the same way that some of these other books were. So this
Yeah.
is just like more of a personal journal type thing. And
Yeah.
he's just naturally writing out like literal love letters to God.
Mm. Yeah, it's like that's his default. He's not faking it.
Mm.
Mm.
Maybe that's ultimately the fruit of mortification, that level of love for God and detachment from the world.
Mm. Yeah, sort of like bring it a bit abstractly again, back to what he was saying with like the old man and the new man. Maybe this is what happens when you let the new man just thrive. Like if you don't give power to the old man anymore and you let it die. Like so you don't just let it die, you kill it. Like you make the active effort to kill it.
Mm,
And I think for the people who, at least in my more personal life, where I see them actively killing off sin, they have that same like radiance of like, you can tell this person loves Jesus. Like I think it's to the pastors, and I'm like, because I met up with one of them. Every time I just hear him, I was like, oh man, like I love this kid and his family. Like
mm,
I think oh man, there's a family that loves Jesus. And that's super cool. Um, and I think part of it shows when I just talk to him and I'm just hearing his reflections about like patience and stuff. I'm like, holy crap! Like, yeah, you already see you so godly, but then hearing that you're struggling and you're pushing through even in your position is like, oh man, that's so encouraging. It's so good.
mm,
Yeah. Um, I think the last thing I just wanted to talk about is that, at least for this quote, is that so many people that I talk to, especially men, have accountability groups. You know, they have like their version of our boys. You know,
mm,
like they have like their group, and they sort of chill with them. Um, but I wonder what happens if we would take accountability seriously. Like it's very common advice to give to people, like, oh, you know, I should keep you accountable, or I need accountability group or whatever. And I'm sure like almost everyone, like a lot of Christians in Sydney at least, has had been a part of a group before of accountability. But in almost all my experiences, apart from the current two I'm in, they have never worked very well at all.
mm,
And I think I've been blessed in particular because our whole cohort at church is guys, and we have quite a lot of us. Um,
mm,
and so I imagine that in other groups or other settings where there's not as many influx of people of the same, I guess, life stage, having such being so lax about accountability isn't a luxury, like in the sense of I have the luxury of like, oh, you know, it would eventually come back around or whatever. Um, yeah, and I just wonder, like, similar to like the prayer for revival, what happens if we just all our accountability groups in Sydney just took it seriously?
mm.
Like, what would happen? You know?
Yeah. And I think it's so common that they don't turn out as well as we hoped because of the things we've talked about before, where it's hard to actually confront
Mm,
and also to confess. But like at the end of Bonhoeffer, what would it look like if we did do that? How much more fruit would there be?
mm.
Yeah, something to pray about.
Yeah, it is definitely cool. How about we move on? Okay. For a while, most of them had an ideological conviction. Those convictions kept them to their duties and brought them to a profession of faith. In this way, they escaped the pollution that is in the world through the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But enticed only by the doctrine of the gospel and by being wary of the duty, they neglected numerous requirements of the doctrine of grace. Once this evil laid hold on them, they fell into damnation. It continues. It hardens them by persuading them that they that they are as good as the best professors of Christ. Whatever they say exemplified in the best professors is so colored by their own lack of mortification that it has no value to them. They have a zeal for religion, but they lack restraint and universal righteousness. They deceive others by making them believe that it would be good if everyone could be as spiritual as it ought to be. And so it becomes an easy thing for others to be tempted by the religious fame. I need to talk personally here because I need to get off my damn high horse and stop just talking about deep. This is ironic as I talk about this. But yeah, I think we're in a position where we're sort of talking about those high spiritual things that
Mm.
Sydney needs to do, and that we're pointing guns left, right, center, and like criticizing everyone. But I think the core here is far out. I need to get off my damn high horse and just I need to live out my faith.
Mm.
I need to mortify and kill my sin. And I think by doing this, this prayer of um, the spirit of mortification would happen. It's not through just like speaking straight out theology or whatever, or like potentially interesting ideas. It's executed by life and by living it out.
Yeah. That line hits hard. They have a zeal for religion, but they lack restraint and universal righteousness. Because like I know for myself, like I'm genuinely interested in like theology and church things, and I'll read a lot. Like I genuinely enjoy discussing it
Mm,
and like learning about it. But
yeah,
then there's other areas of my life where I'm just like, wait, how can I be so messed up and cooked? Like how can I read this and then go and sin the next day? And yeah, this is a very good call to action to do it.
yeah, yeah. I think the last part for me is that. So for the last part of the quote, it says, "And so it becomes an easy thing for others to be tempted by religious fame." And I guess as someone who's a bit more philosophically inclined, yeah, religious fame is a very tempting thing, especially in the Sydney Anglican circle. Like that's how we generally look up to people. That's like the hierarchy that we set up. It's
Mm,
we look up to the those in war, like the professors in war. They're like, oh wow, they're so smart or whatever.
mm,
And it's at least in the EU and stuff like that. I think the barrier that I put up or this perception that I want to put out is like I'm here to challenge and break all your ideas that you have because you guys are living it wrong. But in reality, that's just like how foolish am I to do that? Like to think that I'm somehow better than everyone else because I've thought about things a bit more. Um,
mm,
but in reality, like the way to encourage people is, as we were saying exactly before, it's those people who mortified sin and they have this radiance to them that they love Jesus. And I think those are the most encouraging people in the EU. Like it's
mm,
those people who are just happy and and they're like it's like the Tim Ra, right? Like that guy just loves Jesus that you can tell. Yeah.
mm.
I guess the last point I just want to bring up is a quote from John Calvin. He says that doctrine is not an affair of the tongue, but of life. And I love that from all people, it comes from freaking Calvin. Like, oh, it's yeah, very interesting that myself included, that the Reformed Christians who are very hard, often very hard, and characterized as strong theology, um, is just that. It's often just theology.
That's an ironic thing. Like Calvin has a certain reputation, which a lot of it I feel is actually more from the people who follow him rather than his actual writings. Because you read them, like
Hmm.
he has a lot more. nuance and what's the word, like passion, than
Yeah.
just this cold, hard-hitting intellect who spitting facts. But he's a man of passion that definitely
Mm.
comes out in his books.
Yeah. And I think those are like a lot of the old dead theologians.
Mm.
Like we often just like we cherry pick certain parts and we're
Mhm.
like, this is Calvin. And it's like in some degree it's like a mischaracterization of him. Like when you read the Institutes or whatever, yeah, as you were saying, it's you can tell this guy loves God so much, and through his love of God, he's sort of led to these ideas, and these ideas are meant to be like joyful ones. And like I'm subscribed to a few reform things, and it's really interesting that a lot of times these pastors who are of the reformed theology have to say this doctrine is meant to give us joy. It's like, oh, interesting. Like it has to be mentioned.
Mhm.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe it's because we're so detached and we're so prone to prioritizing rationality and intellect in our modern
Mm,
day that, like you said, we look at these writers who are like, look at these ideas that they're so smart, that so profound. But we forget, like, look at their lives, and they're very
mm,
passionate and people who live out these things. They're meant first and foremost to be lived out. And these writings are almost a reflection on their lived experience. Even when we went
mm.
through Bonhoeffer, we started with that really long introduction because I think it was a good point. He's not just this random German dude writing profound things, but he actually went and suffered and went into a Nazi concentration camp and was executed for
Mm.
for living according to what he believed.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the examples that a lot of examples that we brought up today weren't just ideas.
Mm,
There were people who lived it out, and those are the profound moments that we thought about. Like it's seemingly like Saint Augustine, and you could just like it's not the ideas that I was fascinated by. It was the life that he lived
mm,
and the passion that he had. And I think we're tempted, like going back to it, like because the way that we view someone highly in this Christian circle is through intellect, we strive to understand intellect more. Like we strive to understand theology because that's the way to move up, you know. But it's just so ironic, like Christians trying to move up to the highest points of the Christian social circles.
mm. I
Yeah.
had a thought. Do you think that part of that could be because so many of our interactions with other Christians are in this intellectual setting? For example, in a Bible study, right? If we mention John Calvin, that's a fat flex, or like any theologian. So part of your mind knows that to read about this guy is how to get more street cred in that sort of arena. But like in the past, we would have lived in much smaller communities. People would stay in one place, not move around as much. So, people in the church would actually be encountering each other in these other contexts. Like they'll be working and
Mm,
living and doing these essential things together. Whereas nowadays, we go to church, which at least at many churches has become we're here to hear the sermon and learn things. It's a rational thing primarily. The sermon's the main event, and then afterwards, the encouragement is go discuss the sermon. Discuss what God's been saying to you, which is a good thing. But in a world where that's like the only way, or that's the main context in which we do things together as Christians apart from mindless consuming and entertainment. So really the main context of the main context where things matter, could that be why we have so much of this rational emphasis that we forget that yeah we need to live these things out? Because I think that in our context, you don't get as much street credit just quietly living it out as being able to like quote these guys, flex that name of that doctrine or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Like it is, I think it adds additional barriers. I guess our very interconnected world where, you know, we live suburbs away, but yet we're very close friends. But I don't know if that's like I don't know if that prevents you from doing it. Like I think I understand your point to some degree where um you know, if I only say you once a week, then I can just shoot out some Calvin once a week and that's it. And then like that's my confined space of interaction with you. And everything outside of that, like it's fair game. I do what I want to do.
Mm.
So yeah, I definitely do think you're right. Like it might have been potentially easier. Sorry, it would have been harder to quote these people, but then suddenly live a life that is completely contrary, and everyone else can see you in the Christian or like local community. Yeah.
Well, there's a but there.
Sorry.
I feel there's a
No,
but there.
no. I'm just thinking. I'm just like, oh, like I'm totally agreeing with you. Like, but I don't know. Like, I feel like it doesn't. It shouldn't stop us. Like, I'm just trying to think of ways. How do we get more? You know,
Like
because in some sense,
that's not an excuse that this is just how
yeah,
we
yeah.
are.
Like, yeah. Obviously, our context has changed from the biblical writings, and for better or worse, like it's just changed. So now I'm just thinking, like, how do we be more genuine with when we quote just random flexing old theologians? Yeah, it seems hard. Yeah, I think my first thought with that is to do with accountability groups again and actually taking them seriously. The other idea that I guess when I was prepping this, one of the things that I wanted to try to push more so is this language of mortification back into our modern day and including that within one of the rudimentary, like one of our default measurements of spiritual life.
So it's
And
not
I
just
think,
prayer and Bible reading.
yeah, like how you going killing your sin, mate? You know,
Are you a slayer?
yeah. um, yeah, and I think like maybe we start asking that question more, then it wouldn't be, you couldn't get away with just quoting some Calvin once in a while. Like you have to live it out to a degree. You have to be held accountable to it. Yeah.
It's a good point.
Cool. How about we end it there?
All right, I'll wrap it there. That's episode 7.